we found a number of platforms that are trying to organize the vote for the next general election, such as the Muslim Vote, for instance. Those who came up with lists of pledges or issues close to the Muslim community, such as Community Policy Forum, CPF, the Muslim Council of Britain, MCB, as well as the Muslim Vote itself. And amongst the criteria, obviously, there's Gaza.
Yes.
And the fact that the candidate who is to be endorsed stood as early as possible with a ceasefire. There is the issue of education, and particularly the issue of LGBT and RSE, relationship and sexual education. But to be perfectly honest, and in speaking with several of the candidates who ticked that box, by the way, you don't find that they are nuanced on the issue. I mean, I would often fear that if the candidate was challenged in, let's say, a hustings or a press conference or a media interview, that they wouldn't know the very basics about this issue. One would assume, just like one would have assumed before Gaza, that Zionism and Zionist is an untouchable.
Yes.
One would probably be driven to think that, oh, no, this is something that I can't talk about, I can't touch, I can't address, and therefore I should try to stay away as much as possible. But reality isn't like that, is it?
Yeah, in terms of, I think one thing, obviously, this is the Gaza election. There's no doubt about it, and it has to be because of the severity of the situation. But there's also a real opportunity for the Muslim community to engage in a way that we've not engaged in a whole host of different issues. Obviously, the issue around RSE, around LGBTQ teaching in schools, is something which lots of parents within the Muslim community worry about. But actually, during election times, it doesn't really become an issue that you engage your parliamentary representatives. And because of that, it's not on their agenda. And so I think what we wanted to do is ensure that this election, we could get it on the agenda of an unprecedented number of new MPs who'll be entering parliament for the first time. And so that we can at least get them to recognize this is an issue. And that's why we started the work that we did.
But generally speaking, and your recent report, Could Do Better, is one that I read and I was deeply impressed by. I mean, you basically point to something which I think is fundamental and something which needs to be highlighted. And that is that the majority of the claims being made of the problems within schools are not really there. They are not real. Those problems are often either somehow amplified, exaggerated, and sometimes absolutely manufactured, absolutely made up. I mean, they're not real. So I mean, how did you get to that? How did you discover all that?
So I think, firstly, obviously the problem is, as you say, that sometimes this issue becomes part of a political football in a wider game. It becomes part of these culture wars that we're seeing between left and right. And we wanted to step outside of all of that and say, actually, there's some real issues that parents are facing, because for the past 15 years, I've been receiving phone calls from parents saying there are problems in schools. And so I know that there are real issues, and those issues have only escalated over time and gotten worse. So we wanted to say to parents, look, we want to actually amplify your voice, a voice which is often really not given any credence in this whole discussion. It's sidelined. The views of parents are minimized. So what we're going to do is say to parents, look, we want this opportunity to be an opportunity where you can voice your concerns in a way which reflects what your concerns actually are. So we did a survey. We talked about how parents perceive their engagement with schools around consultation before this subject was implemented. We asked parents to give us case studies of examples of problems happening in schools, and we got just 40 case studies that we published in our report. And then we looked into 400 RSE policies which are meant to encapsulate how RSE is taught in schools across the country. We looked at 400 of those across every major city in England. And so what we want to do is for whoever's attention this report could garner, We wanted to say to them, look, there are real issues happening in schools, and let's try and work to resolve them, because unless we do, we're going to end up with further conflict between parents and schools, something we don't want to happen. And so I think that was the real motivation behind.
So basically, is this report, is it for government? Is it for policymakers? Is it for educators such as school heads and teachers? Is it for parents? Who is it for?
Yeah, so mainly the target group is policymakers. And so actually before the election, because obviously we were all taken aback by how quickly the election was called, we had planned to launch this report and invite lots of MPs to it. And we had an MP sponsor who was willing to come forward and say, actually, I'll sponsor this, and we'll invite other MPs, and we'd get their constituents to invite them to this session. Now, obviously, because of the fact that the election was called so quickly, we couldn't do that. But so we decided to ensure that we could get the attention of those hundreds of new MPs that will enter Parliament. So it is designed for policymakers. Parents can look at it and read it, and I'm sure they could benefit from it. Educationalists like teachers and head teachers can look at it as well, but actually primarily is geared towards policymakers.
And I mean, essentially, what are you saying? What are you telling them? Besides the point that, I mean, you've looked at all these policies, you've studied all these reports.
Yes.
But essentially, I mean, what are you trying to get to when you're speaking to those candidates? You told me earlier that you've written to over 2,000 prospective candidates. What are you telling them? What are you telling them? What do you want them to understand, to get? What do you want them to act upon when they get, and if they do get to Westminster?
I think what we're saying to prospective MPs, parliamentary candidates, is that no matter what your ideological leaning is in regards to the wider issues around LGBTQ and RSE in general, but what we want to do is actually get everybody across the political spectrum to agree upon certain issues, such as the right of parents to be consulted about this subject, the right of children to go to school without being indoctrinated by the personal opinions of teachers. We want for schools to recognize that they have to teach this subject in line with the law, that this subject has to be taught in an objective, critical, and pluralistic way. And what we're finding is, because teachers are I feel that it's their responsibility to convey what they think children should understand in terms of about LGBTQ identities, and say, you've got to celebrate and accept that, which the law doesn't require. And so we're trying to, and actually the interesting thing is that we've had Green Party candidates, Reform Party candidates, we've had other smaller party candidates, independent candidates, some Labour, some Lib Dem candidates, all sign up to it, because if anybody looks at it objectively, these are reasonable suggestions. The pledges that we ask them to sign up to are very reasonable. We don't want the law changed, because the law at the moment allows or prohibits teachers from pushing their own personal perspectives on children around relationships. The law actually requires for schools to consult with parents. The law recognizes parents as the primary educators of their children. And so the point being that we just want what the law has set out in the guidance that was published in 2019 when this subject was made statutory. We want that to be implemented by schools. But
am I right in recalling that even the Prime Minister weighed in a few months ago and asserted that parents have the right to basically have the ultimate say on what their children either...
In terms of the government did go a bit further than it had previously. What it said was that, first of all, that it updated the guidance. The guidance is open for consultation still until the 11th of July. But the guidance had some key points in it. One was that parents have an absolute right to view the resources that schools are teaching. And sometimes schools were refusing to show parents resources, that they set some minimum age targets, minimum age limits by which schools cannot talk about sexual relationships. So they said in they can't do it before year 5. They also ensure that schools can't talk about gender identity as being something real, but biological sex is what's real. So there's certain issues within and also within policies. It asks for schools to be more descriptive about what they're teaching in these classes. So there's a lot of good things that came about as a result of this new RSE guidance. But obviously the guidance is still out for consultation until the 11th. And then after that, the new government, whoever that government is, will decide on what to do with it. So there have been some movement by the government, but a lot of people, unfortunately, because of the way it's been handled, it's been almost packaged in terms of we're fighting the war on woke. Yeah. So it's seen as part of this wider culture war, rather than it being about doing the best for the interests of our children. And so I think the left have been really against it. The right have been really buoyed by it. And actually, at the end of the day, it's become, as I said before, like a political football.
And I doubted that that's something that you would desire.
No.
I mean, it's not that you and I want this issue to become a political gambit that parties play with.
Yes.
And also, I mean, something interesting that caught my attention from both reading the report and also listening to you now, is that, as much as many claim it as a Muslim issue, it's not. It's by far not. It's something that pertains to everyone, and something that involves everyone, and something that impacts everyone. And that I think is the secret to its potency, to its effectability. The fact that, I mean, it may sound ludicrous, but the fact that Reform UK, I mean, the far right were happy with the report. The fact that you have many in the Greens, which is I have to say quite surprising.
Yes.
That sort of indicates the fact that this is something that all of society ought to pay attention to.
So I think that's right. I think over the last couple of years, people have been almost given permission to speak about these issues because of the fact that there's, where we were about maybe 2.5 years ago, there was that infamous clip that did the rounds where Starmer was asked to define what a woman is, and obviously he said he couldn't really define what woman is, and because of the fact that obviously the left believe that it's their solemn duty to protect this whole trans people, but even Labour have moved on from that. Even there's articles in the so-called centre-left media like Guardian, Observer, now talking about the need for women's only spaces, the fact that men who identify as women are encroaching upon women's spaces. There's a wider societal discussion about this, which has made it much easier for people to voice their concerns. 4 years ago, nobody spoke about this at all. And when there was a minority of people within like the Christian community, minority people within the non-Muslim community that were willing to speak about it. But now I think people are more willing to speak about it. There's almost permission to speak about it in a way they weren't able to before. So there is an opportunity to get almost like a very broad-ranging coalition of different parties to speak about this issue and agree upon certain things that we can all agree upon. A Reform candidate person, as well as a Green Party candidate, as well as Labour, Conservative, whoever they are, can agree upon certain things around what they teach in schools. Not necessarily about the micro detail, but the macro elements around what role should parents play in deciding upon what their children are taught in schools, because the law still places parents as the primary educators of their children. So there's still a discussion to be had, but I think the opportunities are there, and I think it's really the potential to create some like a broad-ranging coalition around these issues is really unprecedented.
So, I mean, you've written now to the candidates. How do you envisage lobbying? I'm guessing that this is the exemplary case for lobbying.
Yeah.
What do you plan? What's your vision for the next parliament? I mean, will you be talking to people? Will you be meeting with people? Yeah. What will you be asking them to do exactly?
So firstly, what we're doing is asking. Initially, we've emailed all the candidates, and now we're asking the Muslim community to go to the website coulddobetter.org.uk and find the details of their candidates in their area and email them a template letter that we've designed so that we can get, because obviously lots of candidates will not respond to somebody outside of their constituency emailing them about an issue that that is not a potential elector. It's not a potential voter. But what they would do is, if somebody in their constituency writes to them, they feel more obliged to respond to that. And then what we're doing on the website, we're recording all those people that have replied and are very supportive about the pledges. And then after that, we're asking for people to let us know when they email their candidates and when they hear back from their candidates, so that we can record the data around how many people in each constituency have been engaged on this issue. So then when it comes to after the election, we'll approach some of these new MPs and say, look, we took part in this Could Do Better campaign. As you remember, we sent you an email. We asked people in your constituency to write to you. 150 people wrote to you. And as we know, if 100 people write to you, that means it's an issue for 10 times as many people, because the number of people who take action as a result of an issue is not indicative of all those people who take part in a political action. So then we're going to try and then approach all of these. We'll probably launch the report officially, invite MPs to it as well. And I think that the point is, what we want to do is, right off the bat, for MPs to see this is an agenda item that they need to be concerned about, because their constituents are concerned about it. And I think my issue all the time with Muslims in regards to the elections is that we put a whole load of emphasis, a huge emphasis, upon the election, and then we go quiet for 5 years until the next election. And actually, we've got to think about that intervening period between the two elections as being just as important, even more important than the casting of the ballot on election day. Because by approaching MPs and discussing issues, like even look at this issue of Gaza, when an issue happens, the Zionists contact the MPs en masse. Even though their numbers are very low, they contact the MPs en masse. And so they bring it on the agenda of the MPs, so the MPs are more likely to respond. I was once in a meeting with lots of Muslims who are very not people who are involved in different projects. And I said, how many of you have ever visited your MP, your local MP, about an issue not to do with yourself, not to do with a housing issue, but to do with an issue like Gaza or RSE or Syria or the Uyghurs or any of these issues? And there was not a single hand that went up, because we're not used to that. And I remember when I visited my MP a number of years ago, and I spoke to him at that time. It was I think it was about Syria at the time, and he said, "Look, I haven't got the time to understand every single issue. So until a constituent comes to me and educates me about this issue, I don't know anything about it." So that's what we need to see, that our role is to educate our MPs about issues so that they take action. They write a letter on your behalf to the respective department. They ask a question in the House. All these things are so important in addressing issues.
What are the main pledges? What are the main pledges that you're asking people to undertake?
So in terms of where we're asking for MPs, for prospective parliamentary candidates to sign up to a recognition, first of all, that parents need to be involved in decision-making around schools. So we're also asking for schools to recognize that they should be transparent with parents about what they're teaching, when they're teaching it, who the outside people that come into the schools are, and also to tighten up in the terms of policy around what teachers can and cannot say. So teachers shouldn't be pushing their own personal views on children, but recognizing there's a multitude of different values in the classroom, and they should speak to, some people believe that, some people believe this. And so these are very sensible, very things that any MP, whatever their place on the political spectrum, left or right or center or whatever, they can sign up to. And that's why I think, actually interesting, a lot of people a lot of people said, look, these are I would go further than that. But if you go further than that, your ability to convince a wider range of people diminishes.
Of course.
And so I said, absolutely, we could go further than that, but we couldn't then get Reform candidates, SDP candidates, Labour candidates, Liberal Democrats, Green candidates, independent candidates, all on board with these pledges.
True.
So I think it's really, so obviously we only just sent this out this week. We've received about just under 100 responses. We're receiving responses from Muslims who've emailed their candidates and have received positive responses as well. And out of all of them, there's only been a couple of people who have responded, not even negatively, but they've started maybe to argue against some of the assumptions based upon a narrow view of the fact that they believe there's no problems happening in schools. And obviously, we've sent them the report and say actually the report outlines the problems. So I think it's a good it's a good first step to get us to for my organization and other Muslims understand the importance of lobbying, not just at election time, but also after the election.
And especially on an issue which is so crucial to countless families.
Yes.
And regardless of whether they be Muslim, whether they be non-Muslim, it doesn't matter.
Yes.
But this is something which is so crucial, absolutely. Now, one thing that I have to say, I find difficult to even conceive. I have 2 young girls who go to school. Yes. And we're often bombarded with reports about someone, banging their head or, for instance, slipping and falling on their knee and, there being a small scratch somewhere on their leg.
Yes.
Yet you're saying that some believe, and you have to get this in the form of a pledge, that they will inform parents in regards with what they are teaching their children on relations and sexual education. I find that mind-boggling.
Yeah.
So the current status is that they needn't. They don't need to. They can withhold that kind of information. They can refuse the request of parents to show them what resources they're teaching their children.
So I think you're right in terms of the issue about the resources was because of the fact that most of the people who provide resources for schools are commercial companies. They make a huge amount of profits from selling these resources to schools. And what they do is they make schools sign up to a confidentiality agreement, like a copyright agreement, that I won't share this with any third party. Right. So lots of schools are saying, okay, because of that, we're not allowed to show parents the resources. Now, last year, the Secretary of State for Education, Gillian Keegan, wrote to schools twice to say, all of these agreements don't have any value in law. They don't stand. Rather, you have a responsibility, a legal responsibility to show the resources to all parents, show all the resources to parents, and that you can't withhold them. And now in the new policy, which is in the draft stage, that is being enshrined within the wording of it. So that's around that. Now, the issue around not being transparent with parents other than the resources, I think what happened was that RSE, or at that time it was SRE, before it was statutory, schools were used to doing things in a particular way. Now, when the Act of Parliament was passed in 2017 and then it was implemented in schools 2020 during the pandemic, what happened was that lots of schools carried on doing what they were doing before. And they just if we weren't consulting parents before, we're not consulting parents now. If we're not doing consultation sessions with parents, we're not doing that now. And because there's no regulator, Ofsted's really not regulating this, is not concerned about this to a great extent, schools carried on. And the only time when schools started to change the way they were doing things was when parents challenged that and said, look, what about our role as parents to be consulted about this issue? Where are the consultation sessions happening? Why am I not being involved in that? And so parents almost had to fight for the right to be heard. And so I think it takes a while for that culture to change, but part of the problem is that the guidance that was written was so vague as to the school's responsibility to engage with parents and be transparent with parents, that schools didn't see that as important. Yeah. The new guidance is much clearer in some respects. In some respects, there are still some gaps, but it's much better than before.
You've spoken how you've written to policymakers and to prospective candidates. And I agree with you absolutely that this is an issue at the forefront of issues on which we need to lobby. But what is the position of educators? What's the position of school head teachers, of teachers, of children carers and the such? What is their position? Do you speak to them? Is there part of that report which concerns them and they need to read upon and they need to understand, their roles and responsibilities?
I think in terms of, it's very difficult to speak about schools as like one block. Yeah, they're not this homogenous entity. Rather, there are differences in schools. Some schools, when this was implemented, just wanted to tick a box and get it over and done with, not put too much effort into that because they've got more important things to do, which is the curriculum subjects.
Yeah.
And some schools wanted to do it because maybe members of the SLT, the senior leadership team of that school, head teacher, deputy head, and whoever, were from a particular group, like LGBTQ background. And so they thought this is an opportunity for us to seek normalization or to be accepted in a way that maybe we weren't accepted when we were growing up. And so there's differences among schools. But what I think is most schools do want to have a good cordial working relationship with parents. And so when we've engaged with parents, we said, look, try and work with schools in a spirit of partnership, that if they want the best for your children, you want the best for your children. You've just got to communicate your concerns and your views in a reasonable way. And then most schools will seek to listen. There'll be a minority of schools that will not. But I think it's about that engagement. But I think one thing in the report that is really important for schools to read is that we've taken a couple of random schools across the country and looked at in detail at their policies, and we've said what are the good points in the policy, what are the real good examples of good practice, and what are the areas of improvement that are lacking in that policy. And so I think if a school wants to seriously think about what the situation is like in their area, they can read that and say, actually, these two schools, I'm not necessarily at those schools, but it gives me a good understanding about what the potential problems are with existing policies. And it helps to, and I think one of the things is I've been doing with lots of people who've contacted me, I've given them like the names of a couple of schools where I've seen examples of exceptional good practice in terms of their policy. Now, I can't speak to what they do in implementing the subject, but I can speak about how far they've gone to write a policy, which is not just a meaningless document, which is a document which obviously looks at the diversity of the children in their school. So there's a couple of policies in there which are exceptional. So I'm thinking about how do we at least get across and speak about these schools and say, look, if these schools can get it right, then all schools can get it right. So I think schools can, head teachers and the like, can look at the report, and especially the last section on the policies, which is quite detailed, and they can get an idea of how to improve their existing policy. Because lots of the time, policies tend to be like template policies that a school gets, and sometimes they don't adapt; they just use it as it is. Some policies still have like blank. Like brackets where some information needs to be filled in but hasn't been filled in, like pro forma type gaps. So I think it's really important for schools to recognize that the policy is a meaningful document. A parent can pick it up and understand what's being taught at that school. And so I think we're also looking to find ways in which schools can recognize examples of good practice and implement them across the board.
I don't know whether this is sort of a naive or even dumb question, but I recall a number of years ago a conversation on a flight where basically people are stuck, to each other for a number of hours, and they just have to basically grin and bear it and have the discussion. And sat next to me was someone who belonged to the LGBT community, and when we spoke about the implication on education, particularly, I have to say that she was absolutely with me. She agreed absolutely. I mean, there was barely any kind of disagreement on the basic notion. My question is, have you reached out to the LGBT community and said, let's talk about this? Because surely, I mean, just like, and sort of bringing a distant analogy, but just like on Gaza, amongst the strongest elements of the pro-Palestine movement have been the Jewish non-Zionists. And it is them that are providing, let's say, the first line of defense
Yes.
whenever accused of either being hate marches or anti-Semitic marches or the such. They are there to defend that.
Yes.
So the question is, has that been part of your consideration?
It's very interesting because the people who so-called represent the LGBTQ community, the lobby groups, tend to be more vociferous and actually much more gung-ho and evangelical than the people they claim to represent. And so I've spoken to people who identify as LGB in the past, and when you say, look, you live your life however you want, the law allows that, but actually, look, if you think about it objectively, nobody should force their views upon other people. Given that people have different moral perspectives on this issue, nobody should force their perspectives on anybody else. Just like a Muslim teacher shouldn't be forcing Islam upon the children in his class, neither should the teacher who identifies as LGBTQ push their views on their children. And lots of people I speak to say, absolutely. But I'm actually trying to find ways in which to engage with different aspects of that community. But obviously not to contact, for example, Stonewall. The likes of Stonewall, they're like very black and white on these issues. Yeah, it's they're not willing to. I remember once in the past I spoke to somebody from the humanists.
Right. Yes.
And I said, and I thought maybe naively, I said to him, look, there's different perspectives on this issue. Can we not recognize or try and meet in the middle? And his perspective, he was the head of this organization. He said, look, there's no meeting in the middle. Yeah? This is an issue of human rights, right and wrong. And I thought, there's no way to convince somebody like that.
Yeah.
But most people are not like that. But my challenge is, how do we maybe even going to one of these encampments and speaking to some people and saying, look, what you're doing, the fact that you're standing up, the fact that you're jeopardizing your future career, your livelihood, everything for something that you feel deeply about, which is about the lives of people in a country which you've probably never been to, you've never met, but you're doing.
You're
this,
likely never to meet.
Yeah,
probably.
Absolutely. I said that's really good, but maybe there's a way of us actually engaging with people. Say, look, okay, we're never going to agree with the life you choose to lead. Just like we're never going to agree with somebody who lives a life as an atheist, or somebody who goes to the pub, or a whole host of different behaviors. We're never going to agree with you, but there is some sort of some way in which we can communicate with each other and recognize that we have differences, but we may have things that we agree upon. And I was speaking to a scholar about this, and actually he was saying as well, he said, look, we need to think about how do we engage with different communities, not that as enemies, but actually as almost a da'wah opportunity. And so I think there's something I'm really looking at. Obviously, the balance would be not to do anything which gives an impression to younger Muslims that the people you are associating with, you agree with their lives.
I mean, I think that I agree with you absolutely, that there's a degree of education awareness that needs to be spread amongst the Muslim communities and amongst the communities that are vociferously against the current status of RSE and the such. That we need to find a shared ground. This isn't a zero-sum battle. And just like in the Holy Quran, we have Ya Ahl al-Kitab ta'alaw ila kalimatin sawa. Let's come to a shared ground. Let's come to something that we all agree upon. And like I said, I mean, my co-passenger of several years ago, we came to an absolute agreement in that education and schools and the way that children are taught have to be somehow maintained for the betterment of good of everyone, and that's not something specific to a particular religion or faith. So I think that's important. But something that also interests me, and that is the impact of this issue on the continent in Europe, and how much either they are impacting us or we are impacting them. I mean, is there such, or is there a disconnect? I mean, does the channel basically sever all kinds of influences that come and go?
So I think in terms of, I've spoken to different people in different parts of Europe, and I think sometimes obviously Europe has a lot of European countries are moving very firmly to the right.
Especially now, Eastern Europe.
But obviously even the Netherlands, even obviously France is now moving more towards the right as well. And So you would think that a lot of the, there's like you would think that a lot of these types of, like, for example, Geert Wilders in the
Yes.
Netherlands, you'd think he'd be more socially conservative, and he is on certain issues. But sometimes they can't process two different things. That we almost have a shared ground with Muslims, with their hatred towards Muslims. It's almost as if something they're like, their brain can't process two different ideas at the same time. And I think so. It's a really interesting thing that when I spoke to some people from Muslims from the Netherlands, and they say that in the schools there's very little leeway in which you can challenge some of the things that are happening there. Yeah, actually, here we've got more of a right to challenge things. Now, how long that lasts, we don't know. With a new government coming in place, we don't know. But I think there is. I've always thinking about there's opportunities that I've met Muslims from across the world in different Muslim countries and in non-Muslim countries, and I've always said, look, there should be almost an avenue by which we, as Muslims, working in similar spaces, can almost share good practice around our work. Now, I remember in America, there's in Canada and in the United States, there's been a much greater pushback against this whole agenda.
Yeah.
In America, for example, in Washington State, there was this organization called Coalition of Virtue that brought together Muslims and Christians, and actually the right type of Christians as well, not the evangelical Christians who are pro-Zionist and who just want to jump on any bandwagon, but actually a lot of the African Christians, and they've actually joined together to challenge some of this in schools, in public schools there, and so I think there's a greater pushback across different countries against this type of agenda. But it depends from country to country in terms of how much there is an opportunity for Muslims to almost engage with and work alongside others. Similarly, in this country, there's a lot of Christian groups that are also similarly against this issue, but they also have a lot of almost preconceptions about Muslims, and actually sometimes even hatred against Muslims. There's one organization that I went to this conference in Poland, which last year, which brought together lots of different organizations about these types of issues, and the organizers were evangelical Christians, and they made clear in no uncertain terms that, look, they will not work with anybody who does not believe that Jesus is the Lord. So, and we said, look, does that mean that you don't have the numbers anymore? Yeah, the number that all your people are old people. Yeah, within the next 10 years, you're all going to die out. Now, who's going to carry on the baton? Who's going to carry on your work? Now, we've got the numbers. Yeah, surely there's ways in which we can work together, and they were adamant they couldn't.
Wow.
And so it's really frustrating sometimes that where there are these bridges.
I'm interested because obviously we know the position of the African churches, which are extremely influential.
Yeah.
And now, I mean, and you mentioned the Coalition of Virtue in Washington State, and it's sometimes. I wonder, I mean, whether this is an issue that's influenced by the religious circles or whether it's imposed upon the religious circles, and who is driving this? I mean, basically, is the drive ideological? Is it political? Is it economic? Is it religious? What is that? What exactly is it that the drive for this desires? What's the ultimate aim and objective?
You mean to have this taught in schools?
Yeah, I mean, this whole agenda that began, let's say, about 5-6 years ago, particularly with a kind of thrust that we all recognize. And what drove this? What is it?
I think this is the eventual conclusion in a secular liberal state, isn't it? Because liberalism is based around people pushing for their rights and for the state to acknowledge individual rights to live life unhindered and unencumbered. And so, there was always in this society there was a tension between those liberal aims and the traditionalists who were pushing back against that. So the Conservative Party pre-Cameron was very socially conservative. Now Cameron changed all of that and really changed the face of the Conservative Party because they perceived that they were the nasty party, and in order to prove to the public that they were no longer that, they had to say, okay, no, we accept things that our our predecessors did not accept. So they're the ones who pushed through same-sex marriage in 2013. They are the ones who pushed through statutory RSE in 2017. Yeah. So it's interesting that the almost the floodgates were being prevented by still a large group of people who were holding the line. Now, when that line fell, it became much easier for those lobbies. That when before same-sex marriage was made legal, that was never a demand of the LGBT community. The LGBT community didn't want marriage. Like marriage almost is an antithesis for what they wanted. They wanted to live a life not in the traditional, Tatchell was saying, but why are we calling for marriage? And marriage is like something for heterosexual people. It's not for us. We want to live a life of almost hedonistic lifestyle.
Right.
But the thing is, they had accepted it because they thought if we could get equal marriage, then that will be a step closer towards acceptance.
Right.
Yeah. If they can do it, we can do it. So, so that happens. But what I'm saying is that this is an eventual conclusion of a society which is socially liberal. But actually, the interesting thing is, to a certain extent, they went too far. And now people are trying to push back and say, actually...
there is a public realization that things have gotten too far. And there is this kind of pushback from circles that which essentially you wouldn't have assumed that they would be at the forefront of this pushback. Now, I mean, obviously, what's happening today in Gaza is overtaking everything. And, when we started this discussion, we started about the elections and about you writing to prospective candidates. But I would suggest that Gaza actually made us all and everyone else watching aware of many home truths. I mean, obviously, Gaza is devastating, and I think any sane human being cannot stand by and not denounce what's happening. But the after effect is that people are now all of a sudden paying attention to something else, and that is the model of life that has been cultivated for us.
Yes.
Whether it be materialism, whether it be consumerism, whether it be that the sort of neoliberal democracies that we seem to be part of, and starting the process of redress. I mean, I was recently in one of the university encampments, and in the discussion, I was talking about Gaza and the impact and elections and the such. But the young students, and some of them were postgrads, but the students were interested in talking about, okay, so what kind of reflection does this have on us? The fact one lady said, listen, I whenever a new model of an iPhone comes out, I have to be there. I have to be in the very first lines, lining up from dawn in order to get my hands on the new model. She says, all of a sudden, I'm asking whether that is even considered to be humane in light of what's happening. Now, that took me by surprise because, these young people are now asking existential questions in light of a tragedy that has happened many, more than 1,500 miles away. And that surely has a positive side, maybe an overtly positive side.
But
my question is, what kind of impact has Gaza had on the discussion regarding RSE?
I think one thing I want to piggyback on in terms of your comment is that it's really true. It is true. The Palestine has woken up the whole world. Gaza has woken up the whole world. You see every other day on social media platforms, people saying that non-Muslims saying that I become Muslim because I've seen what these Palestinian people are like, and I wanted to know what drives them, what drives them to be so resilient, in the face of overriding odds, in the face of such oppression, and they almost have a sense of positivity that you can't fathom. So then when people looked into it, they thought, okay, their secret is the Quran, and they looked and started reading the Quran, and they became Muslim. This is amazing. Imagine 5 years ago, people would say to you that Palestine, the Muslims of Gaza will become the greatest people of da'wah in the world. You would never imagine that.
Absolutely.
But also, I think one thing that we recognize, and actually it is understandable, and it it is a natural outcome of our situation that obviously people have prioritized what's happening in Gaza. It is something that deserved prioritization because obviously you're talking about people who are dying. But I think one thing I recognize is that sometimes the community can't focus on maybe two or three issues at the same time.
Right.
So their focus needs to be on one issue.
Yeah.
And so those people who were involved in this work have now have now focused on Gaza. As I said, that's not an issue of blame or of concern. That's actually as a almost a liveness of our iman that has led people to do that. But I think but we've got to recognize that as well as pushing for not just a ceasefire in Gaza, but actually a long-term solution to Gaza. But also we've got to think about what are all the other threats to the identity of the Muslim community here, and not take it's either this issue or that issue, but actually say as part of a global ummah, we're always going to be have one eye on the Muslim world and then one eye on our issues here. But I think we've got to recognize that our children's iman, our children's identity depends upon us also spending a little time on focusing on this issue and ensuring our children are not overtaken by the liberalism of the sexual liberal ideas that have engulfed our society as a whole. So I think that would be the thing that I'd say to parents: focus on, and actually you can do both of those things. It's not one or the other. There's no tension between the two that you got to choose one or the other. But I think as a natural consequence of living here, of raising children, both issues need to be on our radar.
I mean, we touched on the fact that there are certain elements of education that needs to be instilled within the Muslim community itself.
Yes.
And not only in terms of knowing their rights, which is an absolute, and not only on this issue, also on many, many issues, but also in terms of what they can demand, how they can demand, and also, and this is where I have to say, as someone who basically or mainly moves within political circles, I find very, very tricky and quite difficult sometimes, how to create coalitions, how to create friendships. I mean, last year when you came on, we had a priest with us, and who spoke and agreed and verified basically there was a commonality that is there and that we need to exploit. The fact that we seem to be averse to that kind of culture, that every single meeting means an absolute acceptance and adoption of everything that the other party has, when clearly that's not the case. The fact that, well, since we disagree on this issue, then we can't agree or work, create an alliance on another issue. I mean, this absoluteness, either an absolute friend or an absolute enemy. And it gets us nowhere. So, I mean, how have you found this? I mean, particularly that a case as sensitive as this and as widely impacted as this, it definitely requires coalitions and alliances to be built.
Yes. Now, obviously, I think in terms of, as I said, in the past, trying to find coalitions with religious people has been difficult. But there are lots of people from different backgrounds, people who are even atheists who have a problem with a part of this agenda. The way, for example, men are invading women's spaces, for example. So there are lots of different organizations involved. And I think one of the things, when I was speaking to the parliamentary candidates, a lot of them said, look, why do you contact this person? And actually I was speaking to somebody yesterday, I was saying, look, what after the election, all of these people who got no chance of winning, all these people who are part of these small groups, smaller political parties, whether it be like SDP or Reform or Christian People's Alliance or any other of these organizations, almost say to them, look, I want to just, and a lot of them did say, look, contact me after the election, I'd like to get involved. So I would like to almost just set up like a very platform, like even a Zoom meeting where we can just start discussing and actually just build a relationship, because I think at the heart of all of this is a relationship. If you could build a relationship with somebody, where you're not asking them to do anything necessarily. You're just saying, let's discuss and let's think about our commonalities and where we agree upon. And those things we don't agree upon, we can just leave that aside. Yeah, you can, what we don't agree upon, you can speak publicly about what you agree with, and we can speak publicly about what we agree with. And what we have a commonality about, let's work together. So I'm going to experiment after the election, think about how we can utilize some of these connections that are being formed to try and create some sort of a platform to reach out to audiences that I probably would never speak to.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the organization that you run, you manage, Muslim Family Initiative.
Yes.
What do you do in terms of building capacities? Because obviously we need a horde. We need loads of people, men and women of all ages, who are capable of arguing the case.
Yes.
So is that something that you do?
Yeah. So last year, actually, it was last year, probably after we came on, we launched what we call the RSE Champions Program,
right?
Where we've been training up people across the country. It's a slow burn, but we've trained up over 200 people. Give them free one-day training, and then give them support after that. Almost put people into different groups based upon what their skill set is, and find a space for everybody. But primarily, it's about raising awareness amongst the Muslim community about these issues, as well as supporting parents to challenge some of these issues in schools. But I know there's lots of people in that group who want to work with a wider group of non-Muslims, and so that's something we want to look into further as well. But I think the sustainable model that I'm looking at is this RSE Champions program, and we've got people in England, Scotland, and Wales now, and it's just about giving them the confidence to deliver presentations in their area. We've got like a PowerPoint presentation that we've trained them up to deliver. They can deliver it under their own organization names. They can start to support parents who have questions and issues in schools, because sometimes I get tens of parents, sometimes hundreds of parents contacting me. I don't have the capacity to answer all of those. So I'm training up a specialist group of those people who will be able to answer questions and support parents and hold their hands to try and deal with these issues in schools. So I think that's going to be, over the next few years, as we build this movement, that's going to be the primary platform by which we create some sort of sustainability for this work.
Are you, I mean, generally speaking, from how you're seeing the trajectory of issues, I mean, whether it be from, let's say, 2017, when this really took off, the agenda for this, I mean, really covered the airwaves, basically, and became the be-all and end-all. And people were even challenged, you know, put on the spot, regardless of what their capacity was, what their position was. They were really put on the spot. Where do you stand on this? Do you see this either, for various reasons, including Gaza, including new policies, including the government's recent statements, do you see this somehow coming to an end, settling, balancing out rather than continuing this trajectory whereby this becomes a point of contention and a point of validation for any politician who wishes to stand, anyone who wishes to be employed in the future? I mean, I had some friends' children who, when in their job interviews, were asked about this, despite the fact it's had nothing to do with either education or health or the such, but they were asked about this. And everyone was expecting that, listen, we're coming near to the day when we will be, you know, asked about this in order to get driving licenses and passports. Do you see that, you know, changing course, or do you see that still as something that could actually transpire?
So I think in schools, things are changing, which is interesting. But in workplaces, definitely there's a real pressure for people to almost sign up to different pledges, wear different pin badges, you know. And I think the problem is that all of these companies, you know, a lot of these companies are only signing up to the different programs or the agendas because they see it as a way of them showing that they're like the equality agenda, and because they believe that the majority of the population are for that agenda. And that's not necessarily the case, but I think people in workplaces tend to be less vocal than parents in schools, because there's less to lose, isn't it? If you're in a workplace and you challenge it, that's difficult. Now, I think what we've been discussing with other people, with ulama as well, is actually almost creating a statement which is like a normative statement about our views on this issue, so that parents can use it in schools to educate schools, but also people can use it in the workplaces to educate workplaces. That is almost, this is not me speaking. This is like the 100 organizations around the country, 100 imams or whatever around this country. And I think there needs to be almost some work done to try and educate employers that equality shouldn't be seen as restricted to almost one protected characteristic. Because when a Muslim person in the workplace has a protected characteristic, which is religion and belief, that should also be acknowledged, and he should have the right to speak about his normative values. But I think unless there's a pushback against that, a light pushback, not necessarily to have like demonstrations outside workplaces and stuff, but trying to educate employers about this. Unless you do that, things won't change in workplaces either. Like they have in schools, that's only happened in schools because there's been a pushback against that. So I think, like, when it comes to Pride Month and all of these, you go to websites of Argos and of Sainsbury's and all of these other companies, and they have within their logo, they have the LGBTQ flag. Yeah. Now, why would a company do that? It's only just to show that we are out there liberal credentials. They think that would increase their customer base. Yeah. And they never do that for anything else. Even for Black History Month, they don't do that. Yeah. True. So, all of this is like a bandwagon that they jump on. It's not like a well thought through plan that they've suddenly thought, okay, we need to, as a matter of right and wrong, follow this. So, just as they adopt it, that can easily change. But there needs to be some push to create change and understanding that if I don't want to take part in LGBTQ Pride Month, I should be allowed to. I shouldn't be labeled as homophobic because of that, or transphobic. But I think that's another thing that we need to look at maybe as a community.
Thank you very much, Yusuf.
Jazakallah khair.
That was really brilliant. Thank you.
No problem.
I appreciate it. Jazakallah khairan.